Hello and welcome to the latest triumphant instalment of the Scot Goes Popcast. My name's James Kelly, and joining me today is Denise Findlay, who was a guest on the podcast in the spring. And back then we were speculating about the possibility of Alex Salmond setting up a new pro-independence party. At the time, that seemed like only an outside chance, but a few months later, here we are. The ALPA party exists. And Denise and I have both been elected to its National Executive Committee. Life comes at you fast, as the saying goes. A couple of years ago, Denise was also an elected member of the SNP's Conduct Committee, although as she told me on the podcast, that committee didn't actually meet and wasn't active in any way in the whole time she was on it. So Denise, how are things? Are you feeling more comfortable in your new political home?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be in a party that focuses on independence, and that's what we want, and also that will protect women's rights. So I had major difficulty with the SNP and their policy on self-ID, the GRA reform, and just more generally their policy on women's rights and also children. And therefore, and also have a massive problem with the fact of, I know for sure that there's no chance of independence this term, but from the SNP, and probably not forever. So I know the SNP are not going to bring us independence, and so we need another party to do that.
Well, what is the route to independence? I mean, you're still committed to independence. I'm still committed to independence. So how are we bringing about independence via ALPA? What is the route map?
Well, I think on the one hand, I'm not a great strategist and from looking too far into the future. So I only give you my opinion, but I'm not saying that this is, correct. I would say on the one hand, there would be a push on I always call it ALBA because I'm not good at pronunciations, but
I don't know.
Can sort of force the SNP to step up more regarding independence. So, for example, we've seen them have this newspaper that ALPA's cut out of, and also ISPs cut out of, and all under one banner. Anybody that SNP doesn't approve of is cut out of. So it's just Believe in Scotland, who is part of the SNP, and I think it's the National. But would they have been doing that newspaper at all if it wasn't for ALPA pushing them on independence? So at least we can put a pressure on the SNP to talk about independence a bit more. But to me, that's just, it's okay, but we're not a protest group. We need to be a political party, and we need to get political power. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to be challenging the SNP and putting forward an urgency of independence. Now, Angus MacNeil has for a long time with Christopher McElhenney, and Chris, of course, is now in ALBA, he has, they both have been put forward a plan B, which the SNP have been determined never to discuss. So I would say plebiscite elections is probably the way to go. I would not even, I don't think an independence referendum is really a sensible route to independence, just because of the fact that because Nicola Sturgeon has said we need a Section 30 to have an independence referendum, it puts the power with Westminster. That's not what we want. Now, her plan, which is a really bad plan and won't work, is that at some point, and I find it very hard to believe at what point she's actually going to do this, because if we are going to have an independence referendum in 2023, then the legislation has to go through quite soon, because there's at least 9 months that they haven't tested the question, and the Electoral Commission needs 6 months notice. But plus, if we're going Nicola Sturgeon's route, then she has to, a Section 30 order has to be passed by both houses of Parliament.
Yeah.
So it's quite a long process if she wanted to try and have a referendum in 23. So I honestly don't think she's had any intentions of having a referendum in 23. But the real problem with her plan is that Westminster is not going to pass a Section 30 order. And so what would happen is the Scottish Parliament can pass the legislation, but it will be challenged, because all legislation can be challenged as out with the competency of the Scottish Parliament in court. Now, of course, Martin Keating tried in court to find out if the Scottish Parliament did have the competency to call an independence referendum. And the Scottish government actually was against him and said he had no standing, which means he didn't have the right to ask, which is rather strange for a government and a party that apparently supposedly thinks the people are sovereign. Anyway, that is a long process, that court process. So I would say that there's not going to be a referendum in 2023. So I feel like Johnston will call a general election. He has to call it before May 24, I think, because of, just to be aware, possibly the end of 24.
Yeah, just to say it, but I've been meaning to say this for some time. It's absolutely outrageous, because the Fixed Term Parliament Act should guarantee an election before May 2024, and he's repealing the Fixed Term Parliaments Act and saying that the Parliament can run until December. That's outrageous. That's an extension. I mean, that's the sort of thing dictators do. You can't extend your own term of office. It's absolutely incredible he's got away with that.
Yeah, well, he gets away with a lot, and I wouldn't really put my money on him having an election if he doesn't want to have one. But I'm assuming that he's going to have an election. I would probably be, he might just pass another act of parliament to say no more elections. But I'm assuming, and I think he may have one at late December. My best bet would be December 23, just because I think he'll like December because it's cold. And it worked for him before. And so I feel that we could, and then the second thing is the Westminster Parliament is the sovereign parliament in the UK, not for Scotland, because for us, the people are sovereign. And so, but electing people to that parliament, we could, if we elect a majority of pro-independent MPs, then I think those MPs would be very entitled to withdraw from the Treaty of Union, I think would be the legal thing. And then they just tell the world, that's it, we're out. And I feel then it's up to Westminster is then put on the back foot, because we've established we want independence. We've told the world we're independent now. And then, of course, it doesn't make any difference. The next day you don't wake up independent. There's a process to go through. One of the things is international recognition, and then you have to figure everything out, the share of assets and how everything's going to work between us and the UK. But it would at least get us one part of the process. And then the UK has the problem, shall we say, of how to deal with us. It's not us sitting there pathetically begging Boris Johnson for a Section 30. It's actually us asserting our sovereignty and our independence. And therefore, the Westminster government has to decide how it's going to deal. Then we're into another game. In that game, I would hope Alex Salmond and Joanna Cherry are representing us, because I'm pretty certain they would run rings around Westminster and we'd be independent and have a good deal.
My own view is that if we're going to have a plebiscite election, it has to be a Holyrood election, because realistically, nobody's going to take a mandate for independence seriously unless there's a majority of the popular vote for pro-independence parties. And I think that's very difficult to achieve at Westminster. It's very possible to achieve a majority of seats, as has happened the last 3 occasions. It's very hard to achieve a majority of the popular vote because you're in a sort of British election. It's like an away fixture. You're being swamped. with coverage of, from London of Labour and the Tories and the Liberal Democrats, and it's very hard for pro-independence parties in Scotland to get a look in. So I think it should be done in a Holyrood election. But obviously the problem with that is there's no Holyrood election due until 2026. It's possible to engineer an early election, but the chances of Nicola Sturgeon doing that, or anybody at the top of the current SNP leadership, is very hard to imagine.
Yeah, I think the thing though is there, James, is about building of pressure. So if we do the Westminster election as a plebiscite, because we're using elections as plebiscites, you always get another chance.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
I would imagine like a win in the 23 or 24 general election then sets up 26 to be like, that's it, we're independent.
Well, we can't really declare UDI though. I mean, it's we could, but
I really understand. I mean, that is what we're going to do. I mean, it seems like you're putting barriers in the way, but ultimately, we have to be able to get independence or regain independence without Westminster permission.
That's impossible.
Ultimately, yes.
That's impossible because we saw what happened with Catalonia. I don't disagree with what Catalonia did. I mean, it was a symbolic step, but they declared independence and it had absolutely no effect whatsoever. And it would have no effect for us either, because without international recognition, you can't have any effect for a declaration of independence. And there isn't going to be international recognition unless the UK government recognise it first.
But that's not really true. It really isn't. No, it's not. We don't know that. See, the thing is you're putting things that we don't know in the road, but it's not necessarily true. There's plenty of countries became independent without the permission of the owning country. For example, nearly all the Soviet Unions became independent, former Soviet Union states became independent without permission of the Soviet Union. We don't need Westminster permission to be independent.
Well, I mean, we could go through some of those. I mean, the Baltic states achieved recognition from Western countries. I mean, the Western countries were very reluctant to give the Baltic states recognition, but the coup, the aborted coup in the Soviet Union opened up that space for the Western countries to finally give them recognition. And then the remainder of the Soviet states, that was because the republics, the individual republics, signed a treaty and kind of went over the head of the Soviet Union, again, when the Soviet Union was in a very weakened state after the aborted coup. Those circumstances don't really apply to us because Western countries have to have a relationship with the United Kingdom. There's no incentive. There's no incentive for any country to give Scotland recognition until the UK government does it first. You might, you might at the extreme get, a country like Venezuela or something like that. But even Venezuela did not recognize Catalonia as independence.
I don't take that argument at all. We're not Catalonia for a start. We were a signatory to a treaty. We are a country.
300 years ago.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter how long ago it is. And we, in our constitution, the people are sovereign. So an expression of popular sovereignty for independence would do it. I do not accept that we need Westminster permission. If you're saying that nobody internationally would recognize us without Westminster permission, then that's something we would have to work on to get them to recognize. But that's the future. The immediate thing that we need to do is establish democratic legitimacy for independence. So first, what we have to do is establish that the Scottish people want independence.
Yeah, then, sure. I agree with that.
Then the games can be played afterwards over the strategies and the legalities and what we do in the international courts or what we do with Westminster to put pressure on Westminster to agree.
Yeah, that's
all those ranges of things can be done. But first, the immediate thing is to establish that we want independence. And we can do that in the next general election, following on in 26, as I was saying, the build-up of pressure, 26 by the Scottish Parliament election.
Yeah, I agree with the build-up pressure, but that I think where I do fundamentally disagree with you is what the point of the build-up of pressure is. The build-up of pressure has to be moral pressure on the United Kingdom government. And that is where the pressure has to go, because until the United Kingdom government give grounds, there will be no international recognition. That is just totally unrealistic to think that any country, apart from maybe one or two countries that are basically outside the international system, will give recognition. And even those countries are unlikely to do it. So I think we have to be realistic about it. Certainly build up pressure, but that pressure has to be on the United Kingdom government. It has to be moral pressure. People in the United Kingdom.
Moral pressure, James, excuse me. You're talking about Boris Johnson.
Yeah,
no, moral pressure is really not going to work. It is not going to work. We don't build up moral pressure. We, as I said, once we get it told that Scotland indisputably wants independence and we have the democratic mandate, we have the democratic event, we want independence. At that point, then it's a new game. And that's a game that I'm hoping Alex Salmond and Joanna Cherry will play, because they hopefully will win it. But one thing I would not put any money, any effort into is moral pressure on the UK government, particularly a government led by Boris Johnson, because that is not going to work.
The United Kingdom is not Spain. People in the UK, people in England have a self-image of this country as a democratic state, based on consent. There would be pressure, because there comes a point where it becomes so clear that Scotland has voted for independence freely, and has done so deliberately and knowingly, and it is a free choice. And at that point, the pressure does start to build, not for an instant acceptance of recognition of independence or anything like that, but a pressure that something has to change, some concession has to be made. Okay, we don't accept this mandate, but we cannot say that there is no route to independence. We have to look at maybe a referendum. That's the kind of pressure I'm talking about. The UK does have this self-image. It's not Spain. If you talk to people in England and said, do you think this should be a prison? It's in Spain, they would say that. They would say there is no way out for Catalonia, that you are bound for all time. But people in England do not think that about Scotland. They do think that the UK is a democracy and there has to be, a route to independence if people really want it.
Yeah, but I mean, I just go back to my point. My point is our immediate necessity is to obtain the democratic authority.
Sure, I agree with that. Yeah,
and then it is really up to people like Alex Salmond and Joanna Cherry to negotiate for us and to get us out of the union. But first, we need to get the democratic vote, and I think we could do that in the general election. And I know what you say, it doesn't stop us doing in the Scottish election afterwards, but we can at least do it in the general election.
Okay, so I mean, it seems like an eternity ago, but actually it was just over a year ago that you helped to mastermind a sort of quiet revolution within the SNP, and all these advocates. Good guys. Sorry,
carry on, James.
All these sort of gender critical people and people who wanted a much more radical strategy on independence were elected to internal office positions within the SNP, displacing very controversial figures like Fiona Robertson and Rhiannon Spear. And yet, in spite of, there was tremendous excitement when that happened. But in spite of that, within a few months, Fiona Robertson and Rhiannon Spear were right back in harness, because, of course, a lot of the people who were victorious then defected to ALAPA. And of course, those people who defected couldn't have known what would happen then, that ALAPA wouldn't win any seats in the election. But in retrospect, do you have any regrets that huge sort of tactical advance, was let go of so easily?
Oh no, I think the thing about that was, what I would be saying is that it was the last chance for the SNP. It was their last chance. And what really surprised me, and is perhaps because I'm not much of a politician, is I would expect a party leader to pay attention to what the party was telling her. And therefore, when these people were elected, and they were elected specifically to put Indy first, I think was the hashtag, and also not to screw over women's rights. And the fact, if I would have imagined any leader would have then thought, oh, I need to listen. Yeah. See, Nicola Sturgeon is not that kind of leader. She's the opposite kind. She saw that as a direct threat to her authority. What happened is, just before that, there was MSP selections. And again, that had we had a bit of a good guys campaign around the MS. And some of Nicola Sturgeon's favourites did not get selected. Stephen Gettins, for example. And then we went into the NEC, where again, her favourites, Rhiannon Spear, Fiona Robertson, Alan Smith, didn't get elected. And then we had the campaign, which we'll come on to later, I'm sure, with the poll, where her MSPs actually rebelled in the campaign for the survivors of rape and sexual abuse. So now she's in a situation where her authority has been dented 3 times. And she can't allow that to stand, because if you cannot guarantee patronage and you can't guarantee your supporters positions and seats, especially when those supporters are there because they're careerists, then, you know, they're going to turn on you and your position is shaky. And so that was her careerist supporters, but then she's got other supporters that are ideologues, and she didn't deliver for them because she backed down on the sex and gender amendment. So now she hasn't just delivered for her careerists, and she hasn't delivered for her ideologues. So she's considerably weakened. So what she did, she didn't listen to the women in her party. She didn't listen to the wings of her party that wanted to put Indy first. Instead, she had her power base. Her power base is basically careerists and ideologues. So she has this as her power base. So what she wanted to do was shore up her power base. So she gerrymandered them back into the NEC, and she also gerrymandered the list for the Scottish Parliament. And that way she reasserted her authority because she put her favourites top of the list. So the favourites are now reassured that, you know, she can get us, she can, you know, advance our careers. So the careerists are a bit reassured. She makes the pleading video for her ideologues, and begging people that just flounced out of the party to come back. And this was the reason for the video was Humza Yousaf was putting his hate crimes bill through, and I think it was Adam Tompkins had put an amendment that was going to give protection to women, so we wouldn't be chucked in jail for telling the truth about biology. And so there was a huge row because Humza Yousaf was initially going to accept that. And then he backed down afterwards, and these people flounced out. And so Nicola Sturgeon makes this emergency video begging them to return. So that was the start. So prior to that, Nicola Sturgeon hadn't really pinned her sail to any mast. You know, she hadn't said, like, I am definitely with the gender ideologues, queer theory folk, you know. But that day she did. And then that was followed by the sacking of Joanna Cherry. So that was her reestablishing her authority. That's what she did. And one thing it had, a consequence, is when Alex Salmond did launch the ALPA party, the people knew, so many people knew that the SNP was a busted flush, and therefore they left because that was the last chance. And many people that were closely involved with the SNP and understood what was happening realised that there was no hope of independence with the SNP. So they left. So in a way, you know, giving the SNP one last chance might have actually turned out to be a good thing, because it forced Nicola Sturgeon's hand and it let maybe some people see the true nature of the SNP. And if we see what's happening now, we can see a similar pattern regarding Joanna Cherry just going on at the moment.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, you mentioned Joanna Cherry's sacking from the front bench. I think, I mean, certainly for me, that was a sort of big psychological turning point. I mean, I felt that the sort of the gender issue, I found it frustrating from sort of both sides personally, that I felt like, you know, both sides were letting it get in the way. But that was a sort of an extraordinary moment where I realized the leadership really have nailed their colors to the mast. They've chosen a side and they are, you know, basically repressing, suppressing, being factional, and to an extraordinary extent. So yeah, so this is recurring again, of course. And
Yes.
so we've seen something quite remarkable the last sort of 48, 72 hours, where there seems to be quite a coordinated campaign intended to get Joanna Cherry, who is a very highly regarded person in good standing. She's done nothing that would warrant any sort of disciplinary action, but they want her basically expelled from the parliamentary party. They probably ideally like her expelled completely, but they certainly want her expelled from the parliamentary party and to have the whip withdrawn. And as an excuse for this, you know, ridiculous demand, they are, you know, making a spurious claim that she supports conversion therapy for trans people, which, as far as I can see, she does not.
Yeah, I think the thing is, there's two sides to it, and there's a worry. There's a bill going through Westminster Parliament at the moment, and the worry about the bill is, and as usual, they have tagged trans on with LGBT.
Yeah.
So there's same-sex attraction, and there's trans, and they're different. But what happens is the trans hitched their wagon to LGBT, and therefore they're indistinguishable. So this bill is going through on conversion therapy. And what it is if you're gay, if you're same-sex attracted, there is absolutely nothing that can be done. It's immutable. It's like sex. Sex is immutable. You're either male or female. And same-sex attraction is immutable. You're either attracted to the opposite sex or the same sex, and of course bisexuals to both. So the conversion therapy is to prevent any groups to tell people that are same-sex attracted, try to cure them of it. Yeah. Now, right? So trans is completely different. And the odd thing about this trying to cure the same-sex attracted is lesbians. This gender ideology, they expect lesbians to have sex with men. They expect them. That is conversion therapy. That is what's wrong. That's what conversion therapy is. It is telling a gay man he should have sex with a woman, and telling a lesbian she should have sex with a man. Now, the gender ideologues, they tell lesbians that it's transphobic if they won't have sex with a man who claims he's a woman but has a male body and a penis. Now, that was the subject of a BBC report. So what Joanna Cherry is saying is that this conversion therapy is wrong, is totally wrong, and it can't be done. Right? It's a waste of time as well, but it causes psychological harm, and it's causing psychological harm to the lesbians. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to prevent you telling children, young people who are confused about their gender identity, that they might want to think about it before they take irreversible puberty blockers and surgery. Now, we've had quite a lot of evidence that puberty blockers, they're irreversible. They actually stop puberty. And this is quite sad, but if you give them to boys that are young, like 11, their penis doesn't grow. It stays a child. It's ridiculous. Bone density, all sorts of medical harm from puberty blockers. Now, then there's the lifelong surgery. So what you don't want the situation where a young child who is confused about their gender identity gets put on this irreversible path without therapy and understand it, because there's some things, there's a type of gender dysphoria called homosexual gender dysphoria. There was this Dr. Blanchard, and he defined 2 types, but now apparently there's quite a lot more than 2, but there's 2 main types. So a lot of children are homosexual, and then they do not like the changes to their body, and they're confused with their sexuality, and they get homosexual gender dysphoria, which is a discomfort. Usually, vast majority of these people will grow out of it, and they actually go through puberty, and they just learn to accept their bodies and their sexuality, and they don't need medical intervention, and they don't need drugs, and they don't need lifelong surgeries. At the moment, there's a lot of girls being referred for puberty blockers and for various surgeries. Like there's 51 children from Scotland were sent to England for double mastectomies. They're having healthy breasts cut off. Now, and there's also problems for them once they've transitioned, they regret it, and there's some such sad stories there, because a lot of this is irreversible. It can never be undone, because it's the vital stage of puberty. So what Joanna Cherry wants is that we make sure that the children are protected. Yes, so for me, I am gender critical, which means that I think gender is personality, and I think it's very dangerous to have gender stereotype roles, sex stereotypes, to say women have to be Barbies and men can't wear dresses, because men can wear dresses and men can be feminine and men can wear makeup, and that doesn't mean to say they're not a man. And similarly with girls can be tomboys, and it doesn't mean that they're not a female. But the trouble is, we're getting now for children, they're getting 1950s sex stereotypes imposed on them, and so they're getting pushed into these boxes, and they're not allowed to just be. And they're also getting told they're born in the wrong body, which means their body's wrong, which is the worst. I mean, why would anybody tell a child that, rather than, I always tell your children they're beautiful, that's what you say, but so this is harmful to children. This ideology is harmful to children. And what Joanna's disagreeing with is that if you can say that the conversion therapy would mean that a therapist couldn't talk to the trans child and talk them through the various issues that they may be having, instead of putting them on a path of irreversible drugs, surgeries for the rest of their lives. Some of these children, they're quite linked with homosexuality, and they're quite linked with autism is another. So it's people that have discomfort with the world, and they have discomfort with their bodies, but they don't need surgery and they don't need drugs. Some people will, but it's a very small proportion. And that's what Joanna's speaking out against.
Yeah, what occurred to me is that some people wouldn't go as far as you and say that this can never be the right thing. But what they would say is that, if you've got gender dysphoria, there's like a kind of choice of route. There's a crossroads, and one direction is not any less valid than the other. There's a choice of maybe transitioning, but there's also a choice of becoming more comfortable with the gender you were born in, and both of those options are valid and they're not wrong. And it's different from homosexuality, which is immutable, as you said. So there is that difference, and to just sort of paint the two things as conversion therapy as if they were exactly the same thing is clearly wrong, because gender dysphoria does not always result in a transition.
Yeah, I mean, but I definitely don't say that you can never transition. Of course you can, and I know people that have transitioned and I've talked to them, and they know that it was absolutely necessary for them. So there is a small percentage it is absolutely necessary for, but it is a small percentage. It's not, been a 700% increase in girls referred to Tavistock. It's not, there's only a small percentage of children that have just a dysphoria that end up needing lifelong medication and surgery. And it's to minimize the number of children that we go down that route and then they regret it.
Yeah. So, I mean, talking about the sort of the political side of this, I mean, it seems to me the supporters of this ideology are basically one inside the SNP. They have completely upper hand, and yet there's this extraordinary phenomenon. I think Rhiannon Spear has threatened to resign from the SNP, and she's talking about the last straw. What is she doing? I mean, she's won. Her side is completely dominant, and yet they're acting like they're on the back foot and they're losing it. It makes no sense, but it's a kind of extremism. They don't just have to win; they have to bludgeon the survivors to death. Bayonet the wounded, as was it George Fawkes famously said that? Or no, it wasn't George Fawkes. It was Ian Davidson. Sorry. It's like they have to have total annihilation of the opposition. Otherwise, it's disaster, and we have to go to the Greens or whatever. It seems bizarre.
I think it's because it's a religion.
Yeah.
It's not a sane situation. It's not rational. It's a religion. The ideology, gender ideology or queer theory, and with all religions it has their mantras and it has their heretics, and burn the transphobe is the new burn the witch in effect. But also I feel there's maybe a campaign at the moment, and the Rhiannon Spears tweet along with tweets by other organizations against Joanna Cherry is a campaign to have the whip removed from Joanna Cherry, because we've seen it before. It's exactly the same pattern. Massive social media pile-on. I mean, Joanna Cherry makes quite an innocuous tweet. They pile on, led by Kirsty Blackman, Hannah Bardell, and Maddie Black. And then after that, there's calls for the resignations, while certain people threaten to resign, certain people resign. And if it goes to plan, what happened last time? So there was like 4 stages: the social media pile-on over Joanna's support for Sarah Fillmore, the threatened resignations when all the ideologues took the huff and flounced off to the Greens. Then the next stage is Sturgeon will make some kind of gesture, possibly a video from the broom cupboard again or something similar. And then if it goes to plan, Joanna Cherry will have the whip removed, because last time, she was sacked for the first front bench. I think that's what their plan is. I'm not saying their plan's going to work. I'm just saying they're following the same plan as they did last time.
I find it hard to believe that it will work, because they must, the SNP leadership must think it through and realise that, Joanna Cherry does have a certain amount of support within the SNP. Not everybody who supports Joanna Cherry defected to Alapa, and that if they did something as extreme as remove the whip from her, there would probably be a second wave of defections to Alapa. They probably think they saw off the Alapa threat in May, and that would just reopen it. So they'd be incredibly stupid to do it, I think, anyway.
Yeah, but I'm not sure, probably they have another argument. So I would see the argument from Sturgeon's point of view would be that she doesn't want, maybe she's thinking of stepping down at some point over the next 5 years, because clearly going into 26, promising another indie ref, well, it's like getting a bit repetitive, and people might not believe her anymore. So, and she spent a lot of time on in promoting herself at the COP. So when she stands down, she cannot have Joanna Cherry take over from her for very obvious reasons. It's like there's a lot of bodies buried and they need to stay buried. And there's no, if Joanna Cherry takes over from Nicola Sturgeon, those bodies will be unburied. And so the person that she can trust to keep the bodies buried is Angus Robertson. But her problem really is that Joanna Cherry may well win a leadership contest. Her message would be a lot more compelling than Angus Robertson's. So Sturgeon can't stand down while Cherry is around. So, and she can't, because Joanna Cherry would probably win. If you look at the voting last year, and the voting was delegates, this is not members of the public, this is delegates. The delegates voted, I think it would have been 66. So 2/3, more than 2/3 of delegates voted for Joanna Cherry as their first choice, right? And there was about 5 or 6 people to choose from. And she
a lot of those people will have since defected to Alapa. So
very possibly. But then you have to remember the people at the conference are the actual most dedicated. The voters are the most dedicated SNP people. So therefore, the general public, or I mean, not the general public, but the general SNP membership, of which there is a lot, like my mum and dad, for example, who have to join Alpa soon, they will go for anybody promising independence. And basically, Joanna Cherry, if you were to look and, you know, like I said earlier, when I said I don't know, like I don't know what we would do once we get the, you know, the democratic vote, but I know Alex Salmond will know what to do, and Joanna Cherry will know what to do. So if I was an SNP member and I have a choice between Joanna Cherry saying to me, vote for me and I'll get you independence, well, I'm going to vote for her.
I see what you're doing
there.
Okay, so let's talk about the opinion poll that I commissioned for Scot Goes Pop, commissioned panel-based to run a poll about, principally about the Gender Recognition Act, reform of the Gender Recognition Act and related issues. That's one of the most stressful things I've done for a long time, and some of the reasons it's been stressful I'll never be able to talk about, unfortunately, but it's been quite a challenge. But eventually, you know, luckily panel-based are always wonderful, and they actually ran the poll that I wanted to run, which for a while I thought wouldn't be achievable with any other company. So I can tell you, actually, we haven't released all the results yet, and one of the things you were just talking about, the issue of lesbian women being pressurized to have sex or to have relationships with trans women. That was one of the questions I put in. I wasn't sure it was particularly, you know, if I was going to take one out, that would have been the one that I was going to take out. But I just felt there was kind of, people didn't, some people maybe would have preferred if I hadn't asked that question, and that in a way made me want to ask it. And just as it happened, as the poll was running, or just after it was completed, the BBC article or whatever it was referring to this issue came out, and there was a huge controversy over it. So I'm quite glad I asked that question. That'll be one of the remaining questions that I haven't released yet, and the results of that are very interesting. But there are plenty of results that have been released, and obviously the main question about self-ID. So the question was, gender dysphoria is a condition where a person feels a mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity. For example, this may mean that a biologically male individual feels strongly that they are female, or a biologically female individual feels strongly that they are male. At present, most people who wish to legally change the sex or gender recorded on their birth certificate must first receive a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, but it is not necessary for them to have undergone gender reassignment surgery. The Scottish Government is committed to changing the law in Scotland within the next year to allow people to legally change their gender without a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, provided they make a solemn declaration that they are living in their new gender and will continue to do so. In your opinion, who should be eligible to legally change the sex or gender recorded on their birth certificate. And there were 4 options. The option of self-ID, which was anyone who makes a solemn declaration that they are living in their new gender. And only 20% of people said that that should be the test, that those people should be able to change the sex or gender on their birth certificate. And the other 3 options were only people who have been medically diagnosed with gender dysphoria, 18%, only people who have undergone gender reassignment surgery, 21%, and no one, 19%, and 22% either didn't know or preferred not to answer. So, I mean, the other options all, apart from don't know, but the other 3 options all preclude the possibility of self-ID. They're all they all fall short of that, and they come to, what is it, about, well, around about 60%. So it's about a kind of 3-to-1 split against self-ID. So was that broadly in line with what you would have expected?
Yeah, I think so. I think the questions had to be they weren't putting an argument. They were very good questions, because I think a lot of other polls that have done this, the questions have kind of edged the people towards one thing or the other. Whereas I think those questions were incredibly bland and didn't put any argument. So I think the question was good. The only thing I would say about the question, the first question, the question you read out, was you did mention that the government was bringing this in. And we all know, supporters of the government will be a bit more positive to policies that the government is bringing in.
I did put that in, yeah, okay.
There's the only thing I would kind of bias the question slightly towards them saying yes, that we like self-ID. So from my point of view, it's very good, because I know that question is not biased in any way, and we can rely on the support of the Scottish people. I think that the other things I would be interested in is the awareness. So there's 2 things. There's the awareness of it, what it is, what the government is planning, and there's also the importance of it. So I think it would be interesting to know how many people are really aware of what.
Actually, yeah.
I noticed when I do the street stalls, quite a lot. I think more people are becoming aware of it, because it's been in the papers more. And of course, you had an article in the Times, which is always really useful, any publicity. And the BBC have been, they had the Nolan podcast, but they also had the issue of lesbians. And so I find in the street that people are a little bit more aware, but there's still quite a lot of people that aren't aware. The interesting thing I find in speaking to people at the street stalls is the one thing that makes them very angry is the removal of the word mother from the guy. It's a strange one, but I'm very encouraged by it, because I feel like that means that we will win the argument. People do not want this, so all we have to do is let people know what the Scottish government are doing, and we'll win. So how we win is hard, because we were talking about the vote, the 6 words campaign, the sex in place of gender that happened last year around this time. Well, at that point, the MSPs rebelled. Now, some of the rebellious MPs, in particular, somebody like Joan McAlpine, has been gerrymandered out, but others will still be there. So Sturgeon knows exactly who is not going to vote for it. So therefore, that, I feel, drove her alliance with the Greens, so to get the Green vote on side. So she'll have done her sums and she will know whether she can pass this or not. So what we would need to do, I think, is do well in the council elections on this subject, and therefore frighten. We're not necessarily going to frighten MSPs, because I'm sure the reason they rebelled this time last year was partly because they were genuine principle, and some because they were scared because they were up for election. So they're not going to be scared. So we can't scare the MSPs, which is a pity. But at least we can try and do well at the council elections and see if we can put a bit of fear into maybe the MPs who are next up.
The problem is, of course, that it's not just the SNP and the Greens, it's also Labour and the Liberal Democrats. So there's presumably there must be a massive majority for self-ID.
Yes, there is. But the thing is, the government will get the blame because the government always gets the blame. Yeah. And therefore, it's more about if the government doesn't bring in the bill, doesn't put it through, the Lib Dems and Labour aren't going to bring in a self-ID bill. The Labour definitely aren't. And the Lib Dems only have 3, so they're not going to manage. So it requires the SNP government to bring in the bill and push it through. And it's whether they're going to do that if they get quite a kick in at the council elections. So I really feel like that's what we need to do in order to stop this. And I'm not saying that it will stop them. So the second line of defense there is having a lot of councillors to fight it in the council chambers as well. But it will be a long battle. So like the battle for independence, it's a long battle. And we're starting from low. In terms of political power, I mean, like independence and the GRA, for me, I've discounted the SNP completely for independence and for the GRA. So I feel like we have no political power to affect independence, and we've no political power to save women's self-based rights today. But we will get it, firstly, in the council elections, and then more political power, because that's what you need. You need political power.
One thing that's quite interesting about the poll result is that, okay, we know that there's opposition to self-ID, and that's very clear, but there's quite an even spread of what people think the actual law should be. You know, there's like a 20-20-20 four-way split, all about 20% of, you know, so there's quite a sort of division among the public, and there's no real clear center of gravity. Some people think it should be people who have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, even if they haven't had surgery. Some people think it should only be people who've had surgery. Some people think nobody should be able to change their legal gender. So it's the public don't really have the answer any more than the politicians do.
Yeah, I think if you remove the if you remove the don't knows, I think it's just like narrow advantage for having to change your body or nobody. The more harsh side of it. I think so. I think the reason that people had to change the birth certificate in the first place was because you didn't have same-sex marriage, and it was brought in so the transsexuals, people that change their body, could marry. And of course, now we have same-sex marriage. The reason for having the GRA in the first place has disappeared, but not the GRA. So of course, we have same-sex marriage in Scotland, thanks to Alex Salmond, which should be remembered by everyone.
All right, so the second question in the poll, asked if the law is changed to allow people to legally change their gender without a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Do you think biological males who legally become female under the new rules should be allowed to access female-only spaces such as changing rooms, toilets, hospital wards, and women's refuges in exactly the same way as all other women? And yes, they should, 22%. No, they shouldn't, 54%. So this gets to the heart of what the real concern is, isn't it, about self-ID? And there's clearly quite strong opposition to that.
Yeah, and also I think it's a little bit difficult, I think, sometimes to explain things, because people are quite squeamish and prudish about discussing sex. I mean, I have had to kind of learn to say, penis, which is still a bit embarrassing. And therefore, it's quite hard to ask the questions to say, the man will have. So I think that a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people think that the person in the changing room will have no male parts anymore. So actually, to let them know that it will be a full-bodied male is difficult, I think. It's a difficult question, it's a difficult conversation, it's difficult to talk to people about. So I think that's a hard message to try and get across.
I mean, the question that I asked there, I mean, it doesn't do that. It does sort of shy away from using that direct language, but even then, there's still huge opposition to it. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah. I know, again, it's another good thing. And I know from talking to people, it's borne out by people that you talk to, because I think one of the fears especially for women, older women as well, is the hospital wards.
Yeah.
It's like quite scary. And the worst thing is the prisons as well, to be locked up with sexual predators, rapists.
Absolutely.
And the House of Lords, they just passed to say that was acceptable, that male sex offenders and rapists can be in women's prisons. But I actually believe something has happened now, and they're having a relook at the bill, so there may be more to that story. But these things are all they're all starting to come out into the open. And I think originally it was they wanted to do it behind the scenes so people didn't know, and that's really what's happened. It's incredible how captured organizations are, and that nobody knew about it, and it's only now that people are starting to get to understand the danger of what's going on.
Okay, so the third question that I released, or the third result that I released, was about the issue that caused Andy Whiteman's departure from the Green Party. This is a different one because it's something that the Scottish government have already settled in the favour that you would approve of, which is unusual. The question is, if a woman requires an intimate medical examination after being sexually assaulted, do you think she should have the right to ask to be examined by a doctor who has been biologically female since birth? Or should she only have the right to ask to be examined by a doctor who is legally regarded as a woman, regardless of that person's biological sex at birth? And the answers were 58% for she should have the right to ask to be examined by a doctor who has been biologically female since birth, and 20%, only 20% for she should only have the right to ask to be examined by a doctor who is legally regarded as a woman. So in terms of the decision that was made last year, at least that was in line with public opinion.
Yeah, I know, but on the counterpoint to that, the decision was made. The government were going to go against it, and the MSPs rebelled, which was good for the MSPs. However, there is a male without a gender recognition certificate that is now CEO of Edinburgh Rape Crisis. And this person has said that women should reframe their trauma if they're upset about being confronted by a male. Now, there is a physical reaction to trauma.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
When a woman's been traumatized by a male will, it doesn't matter who the male is, she'll have a physical reaction against him. And it just seems ridiculous. So the government, the Scottish government and their organisations are already bringing in self-ID, and without any consideration whatsoever for women and vulnerable women at all, or the safety of women, which I find really appalling. And of course, I don't think much of Nicola Sturgeon, but for this, it's unforgivable. And there was a hashtag that was like, shame on you, Sturgeon. And I have to say, like, that 100%.
Do you think this is still a live problem then, the issue of intimate medical examinations? Would that still be affected by self-ID in spite of the decision? No, okay, that's good.
I'm pretty certain not, because it's, the trouble is it's training enough. I mean, I know quite a lot about it, but it's a longer story, but they need to train enough women to do these examinations. So that's one of the issues with it. It's getting enough women trained, because it's the right to request, not the right to have. However, having said that, the changes, the other changes they brought in with the forensic bill actually make it a lot easier for women when they report rape and when they're getting examined, because for example, they can go to their doctor. It doesn't have to be in a police station. There's a lot of changes that were a massive improvement for women that report rape or sexual assault. So I think it's okay for them, but I still think that having a man in charge, the thing about it, what is that job was advertised under the exemptions of the Equality Act. So the Equality Act gives certain roles exemptions, so they can ask for a female or male in the role.
Yeah.
Mostly it's female in the role. It was advertised under that. And a person without a gender recognition certificate who's male legally applied for it. Now that discriminates against all the other males that could have looked at the job and thought, I might go for that, and then went, oh no, wait a minute, it's only for women.
Right, that's what I was going to say. I mean, this issue of, you cannot possibly discriminate against trans people, even when you're talking about something as serious as an intimate medical examination after a sexual assault, when all that should matter is the rights of the person who is the victim in that situation. If you're going to be as ludicrous as to say that other people, that it's the doctor's rights, it's the rights of the trans doctor that matter, why wouldn't you go to the extreme of saying, well, you're discriminating against men if you allow women to even have that choice in the first place? Surely that principle is exactly the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So the fourth question, or the fourth question I released anyway, was about women's sports, which a lot of people feel very strongly about. Some people argue that in the interests of inclusion and equality for transgender people, athletes who have legally changed their gender from male to female should be permitted to compete in women's sporting events. Others argue that athletes who were born biologically male should be excluded from women's sporting events because they would have an unfair advantage over other female athletes and might put other female athletes at greater risk of physical injury. Which point of view do you find more persuasive? And only 19% said they found most persuasive athletes who have legally changed their gender from male to female should be permitted to compete in women's sporting events. And 57% said athletes who have legally changed their gender from male to female should be excluded from women's sporting events. So it's another very, very clear-cut outcome, which I presume you would approve of.
Yeah, well, I think it's ridiculous, the idea that for men in women's sports, and this means because the men are going to win. It means it's hardly worthwhile women competing in most sports. And you see a very detrimental to women, they miss out in places in the Olympics. And in America, there's scholarships. So it's very detrimental to women's lives and and to women's sports, and to encourage women into sport. If you're just going to be up against men and lose all the time, women aren't going to want to actually even try. It's ridiculous. But it's ridiculous that 19% actually think it's acceptable. And we've seen things like these, the contact sports, the fighting.
Yeah.
And we've got men beating women up.
Yeah.
And it's just ridiculous. And I don't understand why anybody thinks that's reasonable or fair. Because the thing about sport, of course, it's the big fairness thing. It's hardly fair. And also, it doesn't really matter what men do to themselves. They retain male advantage. So there's a lot of ways that men are advantaged on muscle mass, and also just the way their pelvis is, because women's isn't that great because we've got to give birth. But men's have a better pelvis and they have better limbs for running and things. So, even if you take all the hormones in the world, it's not going to, it doesn't do enough to take away the advantage.
I suppose there are a limited number of sports where arguably there isn't that physical disparity. But the thing about that is that in those sports, women are already allowed to compete in the main event. So it's a mixed event, like darts and snooker, Fallon Sherrock has famously beaten a number of men. But, so in those sports, okay. But in the other sports where there clearly is a physical disparity, again, it's the argument that if you're going to allow a trans woman who clearly has at least some residual physical advantages over the other competitors, and why would you not just force women to compete against men?
And that's in effect what this is, because the men, the boys for the girls' sports is boys competing in girls' sports. They haven't had anything. They haven't even had hormones or anything. They're just boys competing against girls. So it's bringing women into sport because males are competing with them, but then later on, there's testosterone levels. I can't think of pronounce it properly. Yeah. But what's allowed in a trans woman is much more testosterone, if I can pronounce it, than they would be allowed in a woman. So, it's still very unfair on the women in the professional sports as well, even if the male has managed to get this testosterone down to at least testosterone down to testosterone down. Yeah, okay. We had the right pronunciation. You don't really need to know that word. I've had to learn a lot. Yeah. Like a lot of new words, things that we'd rather not learn. Yeah. Because like queer. I've been wondering like what queer is. What is it? Do you know what it is?
It's more than my life's worth to try and venture a definition there.
I know. So yeah, unfortunately, it seems to be kind of like sexual fetishes, and so I've learned a lot I didn't know before.
Okay, I'm trying to work out. I think there's only one more question that I've released. Yeah. There's still more to come, but I think there was just one more GRA question that I've released so far, and that was last night actually. It's basically the issue that was dealt with in the Maya Forstater legal about not whether gender critical views are right or whether they're wrong, but just about whether it's okay to believe that or whether that's something that is just not acceptable. So the question was, some people believe that biological sex cannot be changed and that individuals who change their legal gender from male to female should not have unrestricted access to female-only spaces such as changing rooms, toilets, hospital wards, and women's refuges. How do you think society should treat these beliefs? And 20% said these beliefs should not be tolerated because they are bigoted or transphobic. And 53% said these beliefs should be respected as a legitimate part of democratic debate. So I think it's reassuring that the public still believe in free speech and democratic debate.
Yeah, I'm rather sort of horrified at this 20%. It just seems surprised to me that anybody would, and it does show how dangerous this ideology is, how completely dangerous it is, because it is like a religion. It's not a rational thing that you can rationally debate with. If somebody says, a view that male-bodied should not be allowed in female spaces is not worthy of debate and is bigoted, and it's just ridiculous. Yeah, it always just absolutely amazes me what they can take an offense at, and it's never enough. It doesn't, like you can never be you can never be pure enough in the church of the gender ideologists.
That's true.
And if you dare to step out of the total confines of the religion and its mantras, if you dare say anything that's maybe just a wee bitty not quite, then that's it. You're a transphobic bigot, and that's it for the rest of your life, and you will be cancelled, as poor Margaret Atwood found out, and you can never make it up. So if you do step out of this the gender ideology religion box and say something, that's it. You're one of us. You're a TERF, like me.
Well,
and they'll never ever let you back in. Yeah. Ever. You better watch, James. You might be on Team TERF.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's true. Actually, somebody accused me of being a TERF, and I was saying, well, that means I'm a radical feminist. And I have expressed views in the past about radical feminism, and to call me a radical feminist is ridiculous. But a lot of people have said this, that they may not agree with every aspect of feminist ideology, but this is it's an attack on science, and so it's just an offense to anybody who is rational. You don't have to be a feminist to see the flaws in this ideology.
You just have to believe in facts and truth, and that facts are important, and you should be allowed to state facts without being called a transphobic bigot, and without being abused, and without having death threats, and without being cancelled and hounded out of your job. Yeah, you should be able to state facts. It's just incredible to me. Female, saying the word female, according to Fiona Robertson, SNP Equalities convener, is a transphobic dog whistle, and it's ridiculous. And this is the surprising thing, is how it's got in so deep so quickly. And that's the worrying thing about it, because this is imposed from above. It didn't come from the grassroots. It's come from above, and there's a big industry behind it, an industry in the third sector, the Stonewall type organizations, pharmaceuticals, doctors. There's a lot of money behind this.
In terms of Fiona Robertson's, the SNP's working definition of transphobia, I believe, was basically written by Fiona Robertson.
Yeah, and you're not allowed to say male-bodied. Say male-bodied and you're a transphobe. Well, you're not allowed to say, it's part of the definition, i.e. like saying they're male-bodied. So they're trying to remove the words, trying to prevent you telling the truth, speaking the truth, what we were saying earlier about the words. And then the other thing that you're not allowed to do is you're not allowed to mention any case where a male has said he's a woman and committed some crimes.
Yeah.
Because you're tarring them all as sexual predators, which is
that's another question in the poll.
Transphobic. Totally transphobic. And what it is that we know men will take advantage of this. Men, spend a lot of time becoming priests to get access to children. If all they have to do is say, I promise I'm a woman, then how easy is that?
Take a lot of time to become
prisons, hospital wards, changing rooms to these men that they must be thinking that all their Christmases have come together. They don't have to train for a long time to be a priest anymore.
That's just
they don't have to become a well-loved children's entertainer anymore. They just have to pinky promise, I'm a woman. And then here you are. Here, Mr. Predator, meet your prey. Now, this is what the government is doing to women. It is the most awful abdication of responsibility and dangerous government. And God knows why Nicola Sturgeon's doing it. Probably because,
she believes it, doesn't she?
Do you think? I actually think she does, because remember she shouted "shame on you" at Murdo Fraser.
Oh yeah, I think she believes it. I think a lot of people do believe it. I think so. It's probably because if you grew up with being in complete, not all, but really supporting the values of Stonewall, and if Stonewall now say this is just key because to our values.
Yeah, because Sturgeon is a follower, not a leader, if you're using that excuse for her. But when she shouted "shame on you" at Murdo Fraser, it occurred to me that she actually genuinely believed that he had something to be ashamed of, because he came out and talked to the woman. And you're like, no, she is really quite nuts, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. The pressure of all those lies has obviously got to her.
Okay, we've been going quite a long time, but just before we finish, I was going to finish the point I was trying to make earlier, which was in terms of Fiona Robertson's definition of transphobia, which is obviously the approved SNP definition of transphobia. Now, on the basis of this poll, the vast majority of the public are transphobic. So, if that becomes a criminal offence, the jails are going to be absolutely teeming, and there'll hardly be anybody left in the streets. And I was also going to ask you about Fiona Robertson, who I've had my own run-ins with, well, at least one anyway. What's the situation with her? Is she stepping down from from her position?
There's really a funny thing happening. So she says she's stepping down, and apparently Rhiannon Spear is as well.
Yeah.
But we don't know, because the SNP, as far as I can tell, and obviously I've had a look on their website, they have not released, and I don't know if you know if they have, James, they have not released the names of the people going forward for election. interesting because their election is 2 weeks away. It's 2 weeks. It's less than 2 weeks. It's a week on Saturday. They're having their conference the same time as our National Council, of course. But their conference is online and ours is in person, so we'll have more fun. So anyhow, I'm wondering why they haven't released the names of the people standing. I haven't seen them anywhere. It's interesting to me because I sort of suspect that they're not releasing them because they don't want another good guys campaign. However, as if we were likely to actually even try and do that, like we care anymore, because we don't, because we know that there's no chance with the SNP and there's no chance of saving them. But we don't know at the moment who's standing for what position. So maybe you can do a ferret around and see if you can find out.
I was just going to say that tweet that Fiona Robertson put out, after the Alapa defections, when she said, we've rerun the elections, and guess what? I'm back, and Rhiannon's back. Isn't it exciting? I just, oh God. I mean, okay, even if that's the procedure, there's a way of breaking the news, and that is not the way to do it. It was very funny, I thought. Okay.
Right. It's a massive fight, it's a massive fight on behalf of women to save our rights, and a massive, massive fight to win our independence. Really massive fight.
What's the bigger fight? Which is the harder task?
The harder task, I think, is winning our independence. Because I think I think it's harder because it just seems a long way away at the moment. Any progress towards it is going to be, it's going to take years. And we've already been 7 years from the Indie Ref, and I just think the world is changing so much, and is the arguments that we used at the Indie Ref, are they relevant anymore? Because we're in a completely different world with Brexit. We have to have different arguments, and for the people to persuade. The thing is I am sure that people would vote for independence if they get a chance. I'm absolutely 100% certain that at any point, really, since the Brexit vote, Scotland would have voted for independence. If we'd ran a campaign like we did in 2014, any campaign around about like the 2014 campaign, we would have won. We would have won independence. And I'm absolutely 100% convinced, and nobody can say that this is not true. If Alex Salmond hasn't resigned and we'd had Brexit, we would be independent today without a shadow of a doubt. So our problem is not persuading people that of the case for independence. Our problem is obtaining the political power to enable us to get independence. And because the SNP now have Scotland the way Labour did. So Labour always promised to abolish the House of Lords. The SNP, they promise us an Indie Ref. They don't actually ever really promise independence. They just promise an Indie Ref.
Well, it's like Labour with fox hunting. That always used to be the carrot, we'll abolish fox hunting.
Yeah, abolish the House of Lords, and so they've got that. But now, unfortunately, people are voting SNP the way we used to vote Labour.
Yeah.
And they think it's about independence. This is not. So it's how to remove the SNP from power, really, and get independence. So my plan isn't 11 points, because, obviously that's too many. It's just 2. First, we have to get rid of the SNP, and then we have to get independence.
Doesn't getting rid of the SNP entail a unionist government in the first instance?
Not if everybody votes Alba.
Well, I know, but isn't that quite challenging to get from 2%?
No, it's a challenge. I'm not saying it's easy. It is a challenge, but it's what we have to do.
Well, that could take 20 years.
No, it can be in 2023, 24. People just have to vote for Alba. It's straightforward. It's what we have to do.
Are you envisaging Alapa standing in the Westminster election? I mean, not just. Obviously, I would imagine Neil Handy would stand, and Kenny McCaskill would stand.
Well, you know, I don't speak for ALPA.
I know.
I would just say what I would do.
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying, as in your
Yes.
opinion. In your opinion.
Yes.
Yeah.
If
Okay.
it's in my opinion, we need to get people. We need to. The SNP aren't bringing us independence, so we need a party that will. ALBA will. We need to vote for ALBA, and therefore we need to give people the opportunity to vote for ALBA, which means we need to stand. So that's very simple to me, but I'm very simplistic, and I'm sure not everybody will agree with me.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think it would make more sense to, in a first past the post election, I think it would make more sense to pile all our resources into defending the seats we have. You know, if you pile all the resources into East Lothian and into Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, might be a chance of holding them. But if you don't do that, you might spread your resources too thin, and just all you do is split the vote elsewhere. So it wouldn't. But that's my preference.
I think that's you know, people. A discussion, not for me. I would not. It will not be my decision.
Okay.
But I'm just saying what I would do, because I'm like, well, I don't want to wait too long for independence, so I need ALBA to win quickly.
Okay.
So how can we do that? So yeah.
Okay. Well, to avoid the risk of carrying on until next year,
Yeah, exactly.
I'll better wrap this up now. But thanks very much, Denise. I really appreciate your time and for coming on again today, and hopefully sometime in the future we'll do it all over again.
Yay!
And just to let people know, there are still, I think, at least 3, possibly more than 3 questions still to come from the GRA poll that I commissioned for Scot Goes Pop, and some of that will cover the issues we've talked about. There'll be one about dating and attraction, and whether it's fair for lesbian women and heterosexual men, for that matter, to be pressurized into relationships with trans women. And there's also the question about official crime statistics and whether they should record people's sex at birth, or whether it should only record their legally recognized gender. But anyway, that's it for now for Scot Goes Popcast, and see you again next time. Bye for now.
Bye. Hey.